Hello, everybody, and welcome to ABL Down on the Farm, episode 31, second episode of 2025. Very excited to have the show today because we're going to be talking about the ABL Prospect Handbook, which is the labor of love. But before I get to that, just as a reminder to the viewers who may be seeing this for the first time, the ABL is a 30-team dynasty league with 20 slots for minor leaguers for each team for a glorious 600 prospects. And while we talk all things prospects for fantasy baseball on the show, we focus in particular on prospecting in the ABL. So I'm very excited to have a repeat guest on the show today, Dylan, who is now in the ABL and the owner of the Oakland Athletics or the Athletics or the Las Vegas Athletics, whatever they are. He's the Athletics owner. So I'm going to bring Dylan onto the show now. Hey, Dylan, good to see you again.
Good to see you as well, Steve. Thanks for the introduction there. I know I should be wearing my Athletics hat here, but I think I have to wait some time before they settle their Oakland to Sacramento to Las Vegas feet there. So maybe for the next episode, I'll have an Athletics cap, but wearing my trusty Red Sox one in the meantime here.
Right. It's funny. The ABL creates, like, in some sense, a dual allegiance, right? Like you might start getting paraphernalia for your team, but I have not yet broken out all Orioles gear, but
Yeah.
I once did have an Orioles hat. I don't know what happened to it though. So in any event, so super excited to have you on the show to talk about the ABL Prospect Handbook, which got published just this past week, and it's something that I've been working on. This is year 3. For it. And this year, you were kind enough to get involved with the handbook project behind the scenes, along with Tom, who has been working on it now for a couple years. And I was interested just to get your impressions. You've been behind the curtain now, right? And you see what goes into it. And I just wanted, what top line impressions did you have of the project? And maybe we can talk about some of the things that you and I have been kibitzing about for future editions.
Yeah, no, I think the main thing I took away was not realizing how much effort you and Tom were putting into this handbook. And I think if you were to pull the curtain back for all the ABL owners that you release this handbook to, I think they would say a lot of the same, right? It's that they see the underlying score number and ask questions on, oh, why is this guy this score? Why is Daniel Espino rated so high, right? And it's not that you're nitpicking scores for specific players, but it's that you're taking such a wider range of data from different places, whether that be your own personal feelings about a player, but also Baseball America, Baseball HQ, MLB Pipeline, and being able to basically combine all of that information and establish a score based off that. I think it was just cool to see how you guys collaborated on that. I appreciate you and Tom bringing me in this year. And I think what I had voiced to you in the past was it's great that you're able to put together this PDF. And now that I'm in ABL, what I'm realizing is within a day of releasing that PDF, you already have trades flying where teams or teams' prospect rankings are changing because of that. So my thought process on it was, let me use some of my development skills that I've learned over the past year or so to potentially build a web app to host this information and be able to have a live version where once trades go through, people can jump on and instantly see where those rankings change. And I think over the past couple of days, we've already seen that with some of the moves teams have made, whether, even though this was separate from the handbook, there were some MLB trades that went down and people were very quick to hop on the app and see, oh, where did my power ranking land me based off that? And at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is winning games when it comes to fantasy, right? But it is cool to be able to see all of that laid out and see the top 100 with the player pictures and their scores. And I think it's a step in the right direction of being able to have this so that we can release potentially mid-season updates or add player blurbs of our own and add more color to the picture. So I think the main takeaway was really just seeing the amount of effort you guys go through to release this, and I think that the other ABL owners are appreciative of that, even though they don't
Yeah,
see that behind
I
it.
appreciate you saying that. It's definitely a labor of love. I enjoy doing it, but it is very time consuming to put the handbook together. Like I have to manually enter a lot of the data, um, most of the data. Now, Tom came in last year and um, created this workbook, in Google Docs or Google Sheets, excuse me, um, that automates a lot of the calculations, which in the first edition of the handbook I was actually having to go do as well. But it has enabled me to add factors for consideration in prospect evaluations, and not have to worry about doing all the math formulas in the background, which Tom is much better at than I am. Anyway, I'm just a lawyer. I'm not a math guy. Um, so that has been a big change, and I think one of the things that you and I talked about is trying to figure out a way to automate a lot of the inputs from, by using web scraping or other tools that we can to just slug the things in. For example, and we'll talk about the handbook in just a minute when I go through the factors, but automating, for example, the downloading of height and weight, um, or minor league affiliation where the prospect finished last season, downloading age automatically so that I don't have to do it every time. But I'm literally inputting this each time, every single player. And ABL has up to 600 prospects on a roster at any given time. Normally it's a little under that, but we're talking about normally about like 580 to 590 prospects are being held at any time. So I not only entered all those guys, I had to also enter guys in the first year player draft, right? Who are going to supplant guys who are already being held, so that the handbook was ready to go, right? And as the draft was happening, I was just adding players to teams, in the handbook. And then when trades happened in the draft, I would change the affiliation of the player. So all of that is manual. None of it happens automatically, and it's not as if it's linked to Fantrax or anything like that, where our league is hosted. So it is definitely very time consuming. So we're always looking for ways to kind of make it easier, and that will help, if we're able to achieve it, help facilitate updating it throughout the year or linking it to your web app, which we'll talk about also later in the show, because I do want to give that its due credit as well. Where we could have mid-year updates or kind of a running update of the handbook based on trades, and that would be really cool. But a lot of it, it's still at the foundational stage in a lot of ways, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. In terms of how the handbook has evolved over the first 3 years of its existence, because I think there are a lot of exciting things on the horizon. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about as a potential addition to the handbook for next season is the use of stats to supplement scouting grades on specific skills. And one of the challenges there is sample size, right? And making sure you have a reliable sample size in order to use the metric. What metrics do you use, and how are you how are you scraping them from the internet so that I don't have to physically download them every time? Because with each input, um, there's a margin for error. I'm the only data entry person and editor, and site checker. So it's easy for me to make a mistake somewhere along the way. And when you're combing through up to 700 prospects, in the entries that you made, you're bound to make a mistake here or there. So if we can reduce the margin for error, that'd be great. And that's one of the reasons why I think you're a great addition to the team. And I know you've been thinking about ways to get this information downloaded quicker. So hopefully we'll be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think you're right in thinking all of that manual input that you've been having to do is amazing that you're willing to put forward the effort to do that. But for my job every week, basically what I do is work with the finance team to essentially automate things that they work on so that the manual entry side of it is less and less cumbersome. Because as you're learning, or as you know, is anytime there's manual entry for anything, there can be errors,
Mhm.
even if it's one or two, right? It can throw a wrench into everything. So by automating a lot of that data entry, it also frees up your time to focus on the things that actually matter, which is how can I make this handbook better? Other than spending, I mean, the countless hours you've spent entering the data, right? So you kind of have this feedback loop on there of if we can start to scrape data and begin to automate that process, you can focus on, okay, how can I make this thing better? And where I tried to insert myself here for you guys was that I think the PDF is great that you produce, but it can get lost very easily, right? Like I think you had sent me the 2024 one, and it took me a solid 15 minutes to find. I was like, did he email that to me? Did he send it on
Yep.
Discord message? Where having this data readily available at something like abl5.com, you know where you can find it instantly, right?
Yep.
And having that at the palm of someone's hand, and so that they can use it, I think benefits everybody. And like you said, it's a labor of love. We're not doing this for pay. It's just so that we have something to talk about and build a community around, basically. So I think, like you said, third season on it, and every year there's upgrades, right? And it's just the more we can put more thought into it, the more we'll be able to roll out to everybody.
Yeah, no, that's the objective. I think that's the direction we're hopefully headed in, or at least we're trying to get there. And I have some ideas for which I'll talk about. So we might as well launch, get the handbook up on the screen, but for next year's edition as well, and things that I'm contemplating, bringing in. And as you said, like certainly having to do less manual data entry will allow me to focus on other things,
Right.
including like the factors in the handbook.
Right.
So let's add the handbook to the screen for those who haven't seen it. This is the cover boy, Roman Anthony, who ended up being the number one prospect in the handbook, although it was very close. It's a virtual tie with Noah Schultz. So Roman Anthony was like fractionally higher, literally fractionally higher than Roman Anthony, actually than Noah Schultz in the handbook's rankings. But what I want to focus on maybe is just the methodology that I use, broadly speaking, and talk about this. So this page of the handbook talks about the factors and the weights that I assign to the various factors, in grading prospects. And one of the things, and this is all spelled out in the handbook, that I try to do in this is to really use objective criteria, um, and to take myself out of it in terms of how the prospects were being evaluated. Now, the weights assigned to each factor certainly has my input and my subjectivity of how important I think each one of these are. But the inputs, the data inputs themselves, are as objective as I can make them. Um, you know, Scouting grades are based on principally Baseball America and Baseball HQ. Um, and one of the things to you know flesh out or highlight, I should say, in the handbook is that those grades that those two sources use are based on metrics and advanced stats. They are not like, oh, sitting at a ballpark and this guy looks like he's a 70 power guy. Like baseball is well past that kind of old school stereotype of scouting. Major league teams don't scout that way, and neither do these sources. Instead, what Baseball America does is they actually look at metrics, and they have certain criteria um, for getting up to, for example, a 70 fastball. And they look at more than just speed. They're looking at movement, the planes, release point, all kinds of factors that go into coming up with their numbers. And similarly, Baseball HQ is looking at metrics. Um, Both sources look at. They also speak to scouts in the area and major league sources. In fact, Baseball America has just had the senior director of player development for the Red Sox on a podcast. So like I view these as very reliable sources with advanced thinking about how to measure prospects. Um, so I've been using them. Now this year I have last year's weights in there as well, and I actually took down scouting 10% relative to the other factors. and I'm wondering, one of the reasons I did this because I added a factor of position, which we'll get to in a second. But I'm wondering, Dylan, if you had any thoughts or reactions to kind of the reweighting, if you will, of the factors, or the balance of factors that I have listed here on the screen. Whether you have any reactions to that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I can see that frame was dropped slightly, right? So it looks like what my guess is that you're assuming a bit of that frame-based scouting, not frame-based scouting, but skill based on frame may already be accounted for in some of the scouting grade as well, right? So you're still focusing on it by giving it due attention at 1%, but also just reducing it a little bit. And I think what that also brings us to is adding back a large percentage based on position, right? Which I think position and frame can sort of go hand in hand, right? When you look at someone like Moises Ballesteros, like we can assume a certain um, we can assume a certain scouting perspective based on position and frame, and those sort of parallel each other because of that, right? Based on his build, he's playing certain positions. And also based on skill, right? Corette, one of the guys we're going to review, we can sort of assume certain things based on his skills and where he plays, like what he's going to bring to the table, right? And I think it's interesting to see guys like, I think an MLBer that comes to mind when I think of position in scouting is Brenton Doyle, a guy that I think went sort of under recognized for a while and sort of slept on, and was able to be found on a lot of leagues waiver wires as early as last year. We were sort of ignoring the fact that this player was elite up the middle of the field, right? Like he is one of the best center fielders in the MLB. So I think adding the positional weight here was super important to account for sort of what that player's bringing to the table defensively, even though from a fantasy perspective, we don't think of that necessarily, but we should be, because that enables a player to be on the field more and more. And in a league like ABL, where there's 30 teams, playing time is king at
Yep.
the end of the day. And another player I wanted to point out that I had been shopping early on in after I had taken over the Athletics was Starlin Caba, and I've slowly backed off of that take after realizing just how good he is as an infielder, and that staying tool that he has of being an elite potential defensive player could lead to a lot of playing time for him. Now, you can also see the opposite side of that, where you have guys like Oswald Peraza, where they really struggled at the later levels of their minor league tenure, and he can be as elite as possible at defense. And if he can't hit himself out of the box, he's not going to get on the field, especially on the Yankees, right?
Yep.
So I think it is a double-edged sword there, but elite defensive metrics will get a player on the field.
Yeah, I thought it was an important factor to add to the handbook for a lot of the reasons that you just articulated. But stepping back, as I was thinking about this year's handbook and how I think about prospects and evaluating and rating them myself, it occurred to me like, well, geez, like you really think about position when you're differentiating between prospects. Why is it in the handbook? All right. But as with everything in the handbook, I wanted a very kind of deliberate and principled reason for introducing it and weighing it. So all the things are, or at least I tried to very carefully consider how much balance to give them. And for position, what I wrote about in the handbook, and it's akin to what you were just saying, Dylan, is that certain positions attract the most elite athletes on the field, and those are typically shortstop and center field. And it's because those positions are so demanding physically, and require a lot of top shelf skills, arm strength, range, speed for the center field position. Um, and those top athletes are more likely to get to the major leagues, even if they're not at the original position. They can shift. They're skilled enough to shift from center field, for example, to a corner outfield position, or from shortstop to second base. So there are more opportunities for them, more paths to the majors than there would be, for example, a first baseman who perhaps has a little more limited range. Maybe that first baseman can go to DH, but there are fewer chairs in the game of musical chairs for the first baseman than there are for, say, a center fielder. And I thought it was important to account for that as we're thinking about what prospects are more valuable, what prospects are more likely to become average or above average regulars. And that's part of a core mission of the handbook, is to start identifying the prospects that can meet that criteria and, as you said, get the playing time at the ABL level. So that was the idea behind introducing this factor. And it definitely had an impact on the player pool this year. One of the things I was also trying to do with it was to account for pitcher risk in some way. And of the weights assigned, the scores assigned to positions, pitcher is the lowest. It's -5. So every single pitcher in the pool got a -5 at 8%. And what was interesting was to see how that impacted the pool. And I think it impacted the pool more on kind of middle down than on the top end pitching prospects, whose scouting grades were still so high that they were still high up on the board, and got high scores. But part of the position factor being introduced this year was to account for risk for certain positions, including pitchers. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that last component, about accounting for pitcher risk in that way.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It allowed for, and it seems like there's a good amount of that middle sort of trying to pull a specific picture that I felt like fell a bit due to that. Let me see if there's like one guy that I would have assumed was a little higher based on my assumptions of how the handbook works was someone like Henry Lalane, right? Where based on certain traits that he brings to the table and how I know the handbook now calculates things, I would have assumed he was higher. But I think because of that position risk being inserted for pitchers at -5, I feel like that may have brought him down a bit there. Was there anyone else that stuck out to you that you felt like was dragged down a bit?
Not in particular. I mean, it's interesting. One of the things, that has come to fruition because of the process I go through with the handbook is I actually don't focus on outcomes. Like I'm not, I'm focused on process. So like I actually don't study the list that closely after it's generated. Like, I'm not, you know, I try to have a valid process and a deliberate process rather than looking at the outcome and then wondering about the process itself. Right. So like
Right.
I'm very focused just on kind of like the numbers are going to be what they are. And do these numbers make sense? And the way are we doing it in a way that makes sense? And the conversations I have with Tom, for example, it's like, well, when you look at the player pool that we're spitting out, is there anything about this that tells you that there's a problem with the methodology? Because his background is one of statistical evaluation and considering those issues. And so I use him as a sounding board about the process. So I actually haven't focused like in particular on any, given pitcher relative to the pool. What I would say is more there are certain pitchers that I thought were held back a little bit that in prior editions would have been rated a lot higher. I'll give you an example. Like, I talked about Noah Schultz at the beginning of the show was in a virtual tie with Roman Anthony for the number one prospect, listing. He would definitely be number one if I use last year's handbook methodology, and he'd be like, a few tenths of a point higher than Roman Anthony if we, for example, just get rid of position score and revert it to the old system that we see on the screen here, he'd be number one. And I think Roman Anthony might be three, frankly. Um,
Mhm.
so, one of the factors that, impacted this year's rankings was, you know, Roman Anthony's the center fielder, which got the highest grade. It's tied with shortstop. So they get, a high score, of 5, and Noah Schultz gets -5, right? So if you just think about
Right.
that one example, right, there's an impact. Um, there were also guys in the draft, like Ryan Sloan is a guy, out of Seattle that I'm really high on. And I didn't get him, but I also got Levy Sterling in the second round of this year's draft, who I actually had in the prospect, handbook is actually graded slightly above Ryan Sloan. Um, but I like both those pitchers very much. But they were both not, they both did not hit the 9 level in the prospect handbook. And I think in prior editions, they probably would have been higher.
They would have.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll see how this evolves going forward and how I think about it. I tried not to over penalize or over reward certain positions, and I wanted enough granularity on the scale to account for the other positions between pitcher and center fielder, shortstop. Um, but it's something I may tweak as we, move forward in future editions. But definitely something that I wanted to add this year. I'm glad that I
Yeah.
did. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the process portion of it is the most enjoyable, right? Because you can sort of see what you've built come to life. And that's why I think when I circle back and look at the players, it helps me reference the process and say, well, is this what I expected? And how can I now apply this to my league to either trade or acquire players? And after having these conversations with you and sort of talking about the position adjustment, like a guy that I've focused on and tried to acquire in some leagues specifically is Carson Williams, because I look at him and I think this could be a guy that does a Jackson Merrill impression, who's great out at shortstop, but because he's so athletic, he could play all over the place, right?
Yep.
And it's obviously, I think the Padres are known for doing that, right? They pushed Tatis off shortstop, they pushed Merrill around, right?
Yep.
I don't know if the Rays do, I think, for some players, but they just handle playing time differently, right? But Williams is cut from a cloth where I think he could see regular playing time once he's up. And I think it's just they're going to try to insert him wherever they can. And he's athletic enough to do that.
Yep, I agree. I mean, he's actually an interesting example for another reason as well. I mean, I agree with everything you just said. Somebody asked me in one of the Discord chats, whether the handbook was calibrated to the ABL specifically. And it is. I mean, it's called the ABL Prospect Handbook for a reason. And what I mean by that is, these factors that you see on the screen here were chosen in part because of our format and our scoring system, right? So, I'm less concerned in this league because it's a points league and head to head with hit tool. Okay. So when you talk about a guy like Carson Williams and a couple of the players we're going to talk about later today, if you have a low hit grade tool, right, you can still generate a lot of points if you have power and speed, and particularly guys who can walk a little bit, right? Because all that generates points. So in selecting the factors, in considering, for example, how much weight to give speed or power as part of the scouting grade, I elevate them above hit tool, because in this league they're slightly more, valuable. And I don't disregard hit tool entirely, but if this was a batting average league, right? So or a league that had OPS and was basing head-to-head results on those things, like our MDL league that you and I are both in has a very different scoring system. It's head-to-head, but it's based on roto categories as opposed to points. These factors be weighted differently. I'd consider hit tool much more important. I'd also consider walk rate, right? And those kind of things. So, it's definitely calibrated to the ABL. And another way which we can transition into that it's calibrated is pitcher risk. And thinking about pitchers and Daniel Espino, who you mentioned before, while I did want to drop pitchers in the ranking slightly, given their risk, and to account for that with this -5 position score that we talked about, um, I didn't want to go overboard with them. I mean, I already like ding people who have been injured. The injury factors there on the screen, you can see. And I am contemplating augmenting that with more granularity by type of injury. But one of the challenges is, getting information about how prospects, are hurt and how long they've been out, and it's not necessarily readily available or reliably available from public sources.
Right.
So maybe that's something you and I can work on during the off season to try to figure that out. But
Yeah.
um, you know, pitchers are already dinged when they're hurt. I could give more weight to Tommy John surgery or shoulder surgery for pitchers. That's something that I might do going forward. Um, but our league, because it's a 30-team league, right? Pitching is scarce, right? And even major league pitchers face the same injury risks as prospects, if not more. I mean, there's more demand put on their bodies. Um, and so you see in our league, which is an auction league, pitchers who are actually already hurt coming off injury going for really high prices. And the one that jumped out to me this year was Lucas Giolito, who went for $19 at auction, and has a hard time staying on the field, right?
Yeah. And when he
Um,
was on the field as of recently, it wasn't pretty results either, right? So,
right, right. And you see this time and again where guys who are battling injury go for a lot of money in the auction, um, or just coming off injury go for a lot. Garrett Cole, came back from injury last year, struggled a little bit, wasn't really himself, had a setback this year, and he went for over $30 in the auction, right? So there's just tremendous risk being taken by owners in terms of the dollars signed in the auction. So the handbook, when you're thinking about prospects and collecting prospects for your major league team, right? It's suggesting to people that, look, pitchers count too, and having inexpensive, good pitchers, right, mitigates risk. Right now, there are other factors to consider: how proven they are. Inexperience is a risk factor, right, when you're assembling your major league team. But it's the concept of aim small, miss small, right? So I didn't want to over penalize pitching in the handbook, and in fact, that's been true in every single year of the handbook. There have always been pitchers ranked very highly in the handbook. In fact, I remember a conversation on this podcast the first time I launched the handbook, where Duke and Jeff were on the show, and they were surprised that Jackson Jobe was rated so high, who at the time was like not getting a lot of love in the industry in prospect lists. But when I plugged his factors into the handbook's formula, like he came out really hot. Now that looks like really smart because he's obviously done really well.
right.
That's not the point, though. My point was like, because I've made plenty of mistakes in the handbook in terms of prognosticating prospects as well. But the point is, like, you don't want to drag pitching artificially down. If owners want to do that, they can at their peril. But that's kind of the point I'm making is that, like, look, I'm trying to be objective and tell you, like, these are the people that I think are likely to become major league regulars or above average regulars. And there can be mistakes in that; it can be wrong. But that's kind of the point. I don't know if you have any reaction to that, and I'll get into Daniel Espino in a second too.
Yeah, no, and I think it's the proper way to look at it, right? Is that to keep yourself objective and that your role in it is basically deciding those percentage weights. And even then you can see here you're showing the adjustments you made from last year, and next year there will be further adjustments, right? It's just putting the process to the ground and testing it and see how things work, and being able to also work backwards and see, well, how did the players from last year pan out, the ones that made it to the MLB, and is the process we're looking at here, it's an imperfect process regardless,
Yeah,
right? The jump from AAA, we know now more than ever, the jump from AAA to MLB is as wide as it's been, right? So we can do all of this process as possible, and then guys will always come out of nowhere. And hit. And then we'll have guys that like Kobe Mayo that are just struggle. And I think I had him as a crush, I think the last time you had me on, right? And he's really stumbled at an MLB level. Is the sample size big? Not necessarily, right? But it's when he's front and center like that and talking to the media and giving them quotes that you don't necessarily want to hear your top prospect saying, it's easy to look down on him, right? And it's the same type of guy that as soon as everyone counts out, will put up a monster season. And I
Yeah,
think that would be great for him. But it's just all such an unknown, right? So all we can do is further refine the process at the end of the day.
yeah. I mean, prognosticating how 18, 19, or even 20, 21 year olds are going to do at the major league level is very difficult. They're unfinished products when they reach the major leagues.
Yeah.
And they continue to evolve in the first few years in the majors. There are very few players who hit the majors as kind of like a finished, polished major league player.
Yeah.
So we'll see. There's the old adage that prospect growth isn't linear. It's not, and sometimes you have
Right.
late bloomers, and sometimes you have precocious teenagers who are able to come up and do great things, like Juan Soto. But they're more of a unicorn than anything else,
Right.
right? So let's talk about Daniel Espino, who ended up being ranked 50th overall in this. So I wanted to, and that garnered a lot of attention in the chat when the prospect handbook was published. So I think part of the reason he was rated so high it relates to some of the factors here, some of which are not spelled out on this particular page, but are spelled out elsewhere in the handbook. One of the factors is his major league organization, right? He's in Cleveland. And what the prospect handbook does is it assigns a value for each organization based on where they rank in Baseball America's 3-year average of minor league systems. And so Cleveland is one of the highest rated systems in that format. So he got a boost at 3%, for his major league organization. If you remove that factor, he would come down, right? Another reason he's rated so highly is he has 2 elite pitches, right? They are like off the charts graded. Baseball America gives him an 80 grade fastball, right? I mean, that's very rare. Okay. And his second pitch is graded at a 70, right? So when you have these 2 elite pitches, props players up, because what the handbook does is it breaks down scouting from into 2 categories: the overall score and then a skill score. Skills is 30%, overall is 70% in getting up to that scouting grade factor. And your first 2 pitches, fastball and your second best pitch, are weighted more than anything else, other than command, like your control, which is given the greatest factor among the skills for pitchers. So those 2 elite pitches elevated Espino up. Now, things that brought him down, the pitching position we talked about, his current shoulder injury. And this year I introduced the concept of punishing injured players further when they have chronic year-over-year injuries. And I actually specifically, before I got the results of the handbook, when I was writing the narrative in the handbook, I referred this, I gave Daniel Espino as the specific example of why I was doing this. So,
Yeah.
in terms of process, that was written before I knew where it was going to fall in the handbook. As I said, there are steps I can take next year that I'm going to continue to think about to deal with this issue broadly. I don't want to focus on Espino per se, in terms of like looking at the results and then redoing the process. But I think there are ways we can adjust the handbook to even further evaluate players based on the type of injuries that they have, and that may be something we'll see in version 4 of the handbook, but not quite there yet. I need to give it more thought and make sure that I'm being
Yeah.
responsible in terms of like rolling it out. But it also affected
And
players
it's
like
tough. I think there's anecdotal evidence too that with shoulder injuries that we look at when we look at pictures and we're like, we know Tommy John is a long injury sort of to come back from, right? But shoulders get really dicey quick, right? And when you're
Yep.
talking about exactly you said those year over year injuries, it starts to get that worry creeps into your mind. I think that goes back to your process conversation, right? The process here makes sense. Cleveland is used to um, creating something out of nothing of guys that have one elite pitch, never mind two,
Yep.
right? So it's like you can dream on him being healthy, right? But I'm sorry I interrupted you there, but
Oh,
it's
no.
just, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, look, another thing that I might do next year is increase the value of ceiling risk in the handbook, because both Baseball America and Baseball HQ give them an extreme grade there, which is like very risky that he'll
Mhm.
ever achieve his ceiling. Um, so players like him, in future years could be like, pushed down a little bit in the handbook. The trouble in doing that is that so many prospects are given that grade. Um, it's a broad brush. So I've been thinking
Mhm.
about how to properly evaluate it. This year, they actually did get a slightly increased demerit, from -1 to -2, I think. In evaluating that factor. Um, all right, so there's a fun example. At least it was fun to me. As being a baseball nerd. In the handbook that I wanted to talk about because there are two players on our teams, and you know, just to illustrate how the handbook methodology works. And so um, this year during the first year player draft, you drafted Chris Rodriguez of the Tigers, who was a DSL prospect, very exciting, athletic kid, plays center field. You drafted him in the second round. And in the third round, I drafted Kyle Corritt, the Tampa Bay Rays center field prospect, who's going to be playing in the DSL. And I had to pick before you in the second round. And the first two guys in my queue were Levy Sterling of the Pirates and then Chris Rodriguez of the Tigers. Um, and one of the reasons I had them queued up that way, the handbook had Levy Sterling graded slightly above um, Chris Rodriguez. But one of the reasons I made that pick was I thought I could get Corritt in the next round, right? And I picked this illustration just to show one of the things that the handbook is trying to illustrate, which is how close prospects actually are when you use these objective criteria. And I think our viewpoints on prospects can get polluted by noise, social media, bias, and thinking about these things and being married to lists or rankings of these prospects when there actually is a lot more, in my view, fluidity uh, between the
Mhm.
prospects. So I just wanted to pick these two guys as an example. Interested to get your thoughts too, because I'm very high on Rodriguez. I think he's a very exciting
Mhm.
prospect. It's not to say he's not. Um,
Yeah.
but what was interesting is that Baseball America grades the two prospects exactly the same, right? They both have like
Right. Both 50 extreme. Right. Hmm.
right, and both 40 hit tools, both same power, 60-60 for power and speed. Okay, um, so the difference for J15 was in the MLB pipeline grades. And those are the only prospects I use MLB pipeline for is J15s because Baseball HQ doesn't grade the prospects from the J15 class until the following year. And Baseball America doesn't grade all of them either. They only grade the ones that happen to fall into the top 30 of each team. Now, Rodriguez and Correct both fell into the top 30s of their respective organizations, according to Baseball America. So I had grades for them. So the delta that you see in the scouting grade is entirely based on MLB pipeline. Okay. Um, that difference is because they graded Chris Rodriguez as a 60 overall prospect and Corette as a 55 overall prospect. So that 5-point overall grade difference counts really for the difference in the handbook.
Hmm.
Okay. These guys are both 16 years old, right? A lot can change in 1 year or 2 years. Is it conceivable that like Corette will like be better than people think he is at MLB pipeline and equal Chris Rodriguez? Maybe. Is it possible his hit tool will be a disaster and he'll never reach the majors? Yeah, sure. you know, but you know, in thinking about prospects, that's something that I've tried to like use the handbook to do is to really pull back and say, like, what are the skills? What's the risk? And what is the real kind of margin in for error we're talking about here? Um, and can I get the same guy in a later round, or a guy who might be the same, right?
Right.
And when you looked at this chart, did anything stand out to you, or what were your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing was maybe I wasn't as aware of the Tigers sort of having the same MLB organizational pull or rating as the Rays. And it may be that they're more closely at an MLB level, but when I look at the Rays and what they've done with Latin American players, it makes me realize that there may even be another fold to the MLB organization ranking that we might be missing on, and it's just an international fold to it, right? And I mean, you have a perfect example in Junior Caminero there, who basically they acquired from the Guardians, and you can quickly assume there was a lot of chatter in Cleveland's clubhouse or front office rather. And how did we let this happen? Right? How did this escape through the cracks? And obviously, there's been many players in the Rays past that. I mean, obviously, barring his non-MLB actions, Wander Franco was just one of the higher ranked prospects I'd seen in a while, right? From
Yeah.
very early on. So it's easy to look at Corrette for me and say, well, look at what the Rays have done with these international prospects in the past. And having that, for lack of a better term, pipeline of Dominican players, and where he has someone to lean on to in the organization to learn from, could be huge, right? And
Yeah.
I preface that saying I don't know if someone like Miguel Cabrera is still working with the Tigers players, right? Because if he is, then maybe that would be a huge upside to Chris Rodriguez, right? Because he is such a well-respected
Mhm.
player, but former player rather. But I do think there's an interesting fold there and it's also tough to score, right? Like, we can do this by just kind of visualizing it and seeing what the Rays have done, but everything international get there, it's just sort of blurry, right?
Yeah.
It's tough to really tell because it's a lot of handshake deals. It's a lot of right, like we see the videos come out all the time, like, oh, this is someone's cousin and they've been scouted since they were 11, and it's like, okay, and what team's been looking at them, what
Right.
handshake do they have, right? So I think that was the most eye-opening one to me, was seeing that they had the same score at an MLB organization level, but wondering, well, are we discounting the Rays' ability to basically grow international players as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. So, like, let's talk about the MLB score factor. You know, the fact that Corette was in the Rays organization certainly, factored into my thinking process in
Mhm.
terms of the draft strategy that I just described. Um, and it's another reason why I have MLB organization as a factor in the handbook. um, but the grades, um, in some respects, um, are a broad brush, right? So I take the 30 teams that are graded in Baseball America on a 3-year average, and I just assign points to certain brackets, right? So the top 5 teams get X, the 6 through 10 gets Y, and so forth. The bottom teams get the lowest grade, obviously, and the top teams get the highest grade. 7 being the highest grade you can get. Um, you know, when Baseball America does their grades for organizations, they're taking all kinds of factors into consideration. I presume that part of that is their international prospects, right?
Right.
So, you know, I think Tampa Bay is getting credit for that. How much credit? I don't know. Is Baseball America giving them enough credit? Um, I'll put it this way: I trust their judgment more than mine in terms of how much credit to give the Rays for that. So, you know, as you noted, it's like hard for us on the outside looking in to really kind of like assess how much weight to give the Rays, how much kudos to give them in a scoring system for that. So I've tried. This is another example of how I've tried just to remove myself and just use the source that I trust. To tell me like, all right, the Rays are here, and the Tigers are there, and I could say like, maybe that difference between them is important, and maybe I want to reassign the values. But the other problem with the Major League scores, excuse me, the Major League rankings that Baseball America gives every year is that it's impacted by graduations, right? So, you know, the Orioles have taken a hit in the grades, because they've just promoted a bunch of these elite prospects that are up. Some of whom they've traded to other teams, but it's like when you have guys like Adley Rushman and Cowser and Mayo and all these guys getting promoted, right? Your score in Baseball America goes down. So there is kind of like an over and under inclusiveness in considering it this way. So definitely something I'm like open to considering and discussing. It's just what is the right methodology for kind of moving forward and kind of evaluating this issue.
Right. Yeah, and you're exactly right in assuming we know organizations like Baseball America are closer to the conversation than we are, right? And I actually assume Miguel Cabrera being a special assistant in the Tigers organization, may even increase, like even just that player alone. Like I feel like when I talk to some of my brother's friends, he's in his early 20s, and they just don't even realize how good Miguel Cabrera was at one point. It's not even how good he was. It was the type of player he was. He was one of the most loved players in the game for years and still is, right? So him moving into that front office role for me sort of propped Rodriguez up artificially in my rankings and thinking, I know he was involved with this process. There's no way he was not. And sort of trusting a guy that's been around that game and has the contacts in those regions and knows who to talk to, right? So, but I can see your perspective from the first year player draft. You're looking at it like, well, I could get Rodriguez and Corrette here, but I could also get Corrette a little later and another guy that I have ranked higher, and sort of instead of having these two guys in similar positions, I can now sort of spread my risk across in the conversation that we're having, needing pitching. Right. We're talking about a draft where I think I got 4 in the auction, and I already have 2 that have elbow issues. So things can change very quickly in needing starting pitching depth for sure.
Yep, definitely. Before I want to give some time to your analytics website. But before that, I just wanted to put up the farm ranking systems on the page in the handbook, and just ask you if anything here surprised you in terms of outcomes.
Yeah, taking a look at it here, you can see, so it looks like it's you, Royals, Astros, sort of rounding out the top here. I did feel like my rank was a bit propped up just due to sort of my top ranked players, right? I had a couple of 9.9s, I think, listed in there somewhere. So, and also some guys dragging down my rank as well, right? But it does seem like there's some decent weight to the top, I don't know, 9 or so teams, and you can quickly see it begin to slope off once we get into the final third listing here. But it was also interesting to see there's some farm systems that are ranked here pretty highly that also have really good MLB teams as well, right? We know Duke's team is probably the team to beat here. We know, but on the other hand, we have some highly projected teams per my app from an MLB perspective that their minor leagues are slacking compared to others, right? So as I'm learning with my first, I think I've been in ABL for maybe 6 months now, even though it feels like it's been 6 days, and turned over the roster a bit. I'm glad. I'll say the one thing I'm glad to see is that I haven't completely destroyed the minor leaguers that I was handed over. Right, I was able to make a few moves, acquire guys that I was interested in Sebastian Walcott, Aiden Smith,
Mhm.
uh, while also moving on from some that I didn't necessarily believe fully in, like Samuel Basayo, uh, to acquire Shohei Ohtani. So I will say the one thing I took away was I'm glad I didn't destroy my.
Oh, that's fair enough. That's fair
Yeah,
enough.
I'm glad I didn't destroy the team that I slightly inherited, even though
Yeah,
I did.
Dave, who had the A's before you, was a very shrewd prospector. So you inherited
Yeah,
a pretty good minor league system.
yeah,
I think one of the interesting things to me, because you alluded to it, is actually this page of the handbook, which shows the top 10 over the last 3 years in the handbook. And I put in bold the teams that have been in the top 10 each year. And two things really stood out to me in this. One was the last three champions, the Tigers, Royals, and Pirates, are all on that list, right? Um, and you know what that goes to, I think, illustrate is just what strong owners they are, but also this concept of building through your farm, and that these prospects coming up at an inexpensive like contract and forming a foundation for these teams so that they can go then acquire strategically higher priced players, um, has really proved beneficial to these owners. And they're not guys who willy nilly just trade away their prospects. They're
yeah.
very deliberate, and so they're on this list, and that's a message to me.
Mhm.
Um, the other thing I thought was kind of cool about this was that Cal and the Angels got into the top 10. Um,
Mhm.
his team has struggled over the first 3 years in the ABL, and he kind of pivoted last year and really went into a collection of assets. And I think he did a really nice job at the trade deadline, getting some good prospects, and during the kind of period leading up to the trade deadline as well. And had a pretty solid draft, and he's now in the top 10, and that was kind of cool, to see. Um,
Yeah,
and Evan is in here, as the Astros owner, another team that has taken over. You're in there, to sort of see that like there have been new owners who are coming in have been able to be strong additions to the league and have like really good farm systems as well. It's kind of cool.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's definitely. I think the I'm fairly new to head to head in general. I know we're in that. We talk about the Major League Dynasty League we're in, and that was sort of my first go at head to head. And I understand ABL is maybe slightly different from that because of it's head to head points and not head to head categories. I do think head to head categories is closer to rotisserie than points, but. Uh, Really, when you're in a league this deep and you see how some of the league winners also have strong farms, I assume they're sharp owners and they know, you know what, there's times where you have to move top prospects if you're in a pinch and really need to make a run towards the end of the deadline. But you also have to weigh the opportunity cost of, well, if I move this prospect, how much of the needle does it move for me?
yep.
Right? Because there is a lot of randomness in head to head matchups. And if you're going to be out there shelling out prospects, and I'll say in that Major League Dynasty league, I maybe even traded Bryson Stott to you. I can't remember but there was a few moves of prospects that quickly rose through the ranks. Bryson Stott, Jordan Westberg, that I was quick to move on from. That in hindsight may not have been the smartest decision due to the head to head playoff
Yep.
randomness and how easily it is to sort of go on a quick run, or also on the other side, flip side of things, you could have someone like Aaron Judge who just decides to shut off in September, and then you're stuck wondering, well, what am I supposed to do here? This is my best
Right.
player, and he's supposed to be carrying my team. So there's only there's times where you have to move top prospects, and there's times where you may not be moving the needle as much as you think, I believe.
Yep. Yep. So I do want to give time to your
Mhm.
brand new invention, the ABL
Yes,
analytics website. So um, I know you wanted to share the screen, so I'll let you do
yeah,
that.
let me, let's see. All right. this here. Okay, if you can confirm, you can see it here on your side.
Not yet. Let me see if I can.
Looks like it's sharing from my side, but I might be frozen here.
Well, while we're trying to work out the technical difficulties, I can also hear in the background the notion listen to your family.
The baby.
Yeah, your screen is like freezing up a little bit. It might be due to trying to share. But why don't we talk about it generally? And if we can get it to display, we can do that. But what was the kind of impetus for this? And I think it's great that you've done this for the league and put this resource up and be available. But talk a little bit about the process and kind of like what's been involved on the back end, because we talked earlier about the prospect behind the curtain. What's behind the curtain for you?
Yeah, so I think really the main sticking point for me was um, everyone that's in the ABL, right? We're diehard fantasy baseball players at the end of the day, and as much as I love Fantrax, I think its capabilities are a bit limited in what it offers. So I wanted to basically create a resource that would really kind of account for some of the things that Fantrax couldn't provide. And the initial thought came from just a conversation I had with Tyler, the Minnesota Twins manager, which was that I believe him and the previous athletics manager were basically doing like a weekly power ranking through Google Sheets. And similar to what I voiced to you about just getting the handbook in front of people so that they can easily see it, my thought process was, well, if I want to look at this power ranking, like Google Sheets is like mediocre. Like I understand if there's only one tool available, great. But if we could bring this online and make it interactive and also directly tie it to Fantrax, I think we could really make a powerful tool here. So basically the premise of it was, let's get the handbook linked. Let's get Tyler's power rankings linked, and let's link the Fantrax League. And the process behind that was all Duke had to do was mark the league as publicly viewable. And I was able to basically create API calls to pull in information from team rosters, available players, et cetera, et cetera. So without further ado, are you able to see this here? Are you still
It's not coming through on
unable?
my end. It's not coming through.
Here,
On
I'll
my
try to drop you the link to see if
Sure.
you're able to pull it up there.
Let me see if I can screen share this. All right, it's just loading on my side.
Mhm.
So I'll see if I can pull it up. So I mean,
So I think, yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, sir.
No, go ahead.
I think by far the best aspect of it is that you could make a prospect for prospect trade, come in here and see your updated team ranking, right? I think one of the cool parts about your handbook is that you're not only providing a top 100, but you're providing each team's ranking based on their players, right? So if you complete a trade within Fantrax, you could come here within 5 seconds of that trade being accepted and see your updated team. So looking across the menu here, we can see this is the league info tab. This sort of just pulls in and says the name of the league and all that. This power rankings, this is going to list off based on a calculation that Tyler had sent me. And what this will do is update throughout the course of weekly matchups and throughout the season. Once again, this will continue to update live and show where teams are based on Tyler's calculation. And I don't have that in front of me, but the plan is to also go on Tyler's podcast to discuss the power rankings here a bit as well. So
Awesome.
And then we have our handbook tab. Yeah.
Yep, and there's the ABL top 100 right there. We're rolling through. Mm-hmm. You can see the aforementioned Noah Schultz. Yep.
Yeah, so and you can see that these are all linked to the specific team they're in ABL as well,
Yep.
not necessarily their MLB team. And if you actually scroll to the bottom of this here, we will see the team rankings as well.
Very cool. Yeah, let's get to the bottom here. Top 100. So I know one of the challenges for you was finding a server that could host this without breaking your budget. Yeah, this is
Yeah.
very cool. This
Yeah, so you can actually click into these here. If you were to click into, say, like the AL West, you could see, or any of them
I
here.
just
Yep.
happened to click the central, but yeah,
Yeah, so and if you hover over it, you can actually see the total and average score of each team as well. Um,
very cool.
so each sunburst basically breaks out into their divisions and where each division ranks from a prospecting standpoint as well. So you can see you're carrying the AL East a bit there,
Right.
where you could, and it's funny, like you can see the AL West is actually it's weirdly top heavy as well. Um, so I think that may even been due to the Rangers making a few moves over the past couple days, and maybe the Nationals as well.
Yeah.
And then if
Very
we scroll
interesting.
down further, we will see the team rankings as well.
There they are.
Yep, and then you can click View Team Prospects to see the full list of each team's players and also their scores. So,
Very
yeah, I
cool.
think this being able to update without any action from us from a fan track standpoint, I think just makes it all the more fun to look at. And something as easily as if we decide to do handbook updates in season, seeing how this flows through will be cool. And just it allows everyone another outlet to be able to enjoy the league at the end of the day.
Yeah, this is great. It's an amazing, addition to the league, and I think it's pretty remarkable that we have a league where we have like, 2 podcasts and now a website and people
Yeah.
devoting all this time to the league. And hopefully, people enjoy, these additions. I was joking with Duke that we should start thinking about like getting an LLC form to like buy the league rights because he's going to get bought out by somebody. um,
Right, right.
you know,
Yeah,
but
and as we saw in this off season too, we had some issues with uh, the auction draft on and off, and to no fault of our own, and no fault of couch managers either. And you can see what happens quickly with these websites when they're overwhelmed with um, people refreshing the page. But the thought process going further could even be we could build our own auction platform that automatically pulls the free agents into that website and allows people to just log on there and be able to bid. And we could even tailor that auction based on how we want it to be, right?
yep,
So not necessarily relying on how couch managers allow. So yeah, I think the possibilities with it are endless at the end of
that's
the day.
great. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, Dylan, I'll let you get back to your daughter and your family, and but I really
Thank you.
appreciate you coming on the show and talking about this, and for your contributions to the handbook this year, and the opportunity we'll have to work together on it next year. I'm looking forward to that as well. Hope everybody enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next time. But in the meantime, remember to ABP, always be prospecting.
AVP. Thanks, Steve. Good to
Yep.
talk.
Bye.
Have a good one.